The scream that tore through Ravenwood Hollow that night was not the last one anyone expected to hear, it was the first sound that made a dead man's heart remember how to ache. Stay with me until the end, because what happened between them in these woods will make you question everything you thought you knew about monsters, and about love. Mara Callahan had never believed in ghost stories until the night the fog rolled in wrong. It came low and thick across the tree line behind her family's farmhouse, curling between the pines like something breathing, something patient. She stood at her bedroom window watching it swallow the old dirt road, and for reasons she couldn't name, her hands had gone cold against the glass. The town of Ravenwood Hollow had always worn its silence like a coat: quiet streets, quiet people, quiet secrets buried under decades of pine needles and unspoken history. But tonight the silence felt different. It felt like waiting. She was 24, a schoolteacher with paint-stained fingers and a habit of talking to herself when she graded papers late into the night. Her mother had passed 3 winters ago, and her father had followed less than a year after, leaving her alone in the farmhouse at the edge of town with nothing but memories and a stubborn refusal to sell the land. People whispered that the Callahan house sat too close to the old quarantine woods, the stretch of forest fenced off since the outbreak years, back when Ravenwood Hollow had been ground zero for something the government never fully explained. Officially, it was over. Contained. A tragedy from another decade. Unofficially, no one who lived near those woods slept with their windows open. Mara told herself the noises were deer. The shapes were shadows. The cold spots in the hallway were just an old house settling into itself. She told herself a lot of things to keep the fear at a manageable distance, and for 3 years, it had worked. Until tonight. The first sound was a branch snapping, sharp, deliberate, too heavy to be an animal. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she watched a shape detach itself from the fog at the edge of the trees. Not an animal. A person. Stumbling, dragging one leg, arms hanging wrong at the shoulders like a marionette with half its strings cut. She knew, with the kind of certainty that lives in the base of the spine, exactly what she was looking at. The scream that left her wasn't a decision. It was instinct, raw and involuntary, torn loose before her mind caught up to her body. She backed away from the window as the shape outside straightened, too fast, too fluid for something that had looked broken seconds before, and turned its face toward the house. Toward her light. Toward her. Mara ran. She hit the stairs 2 at a time, her bare feet slapping cold wood, her heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. The front door. She needed the front door, needed her car keys, needed to be anywhere but inside this house with something dead walking toward it. But when she yanked the door open, the porch light flickered once, twice, and died, plunging the yard into a darkness so complete it felt like a held breath. 3 more shapes emerged from the fog. They moved differently than the first, jerking, hungry, drawn by the sound of her scream like moths finding flame. Mara's mind screamed at her to slam the door, to lock it, to hide, but her hand had frozen on the frame, every instinct short-circuiting at once. This wasn't supposed to be real. This was supposed to be the story people told to keep their children away from the tree line. The nearest one reached the bottom porch step. And then something hit it from the side with the force of a freight train. Mara stumbled backward as the shape, the infected, the thing she'd been about to face alone, was thrown clear off its feet, crashing into the dirt 10 yards away. A second figure stood where it had been. Taller. Broader. Moving with a strange, coiled grace that didn't match the jerking horror of the others. He turned toward her, and even in the near-total dark, she saw his eyes. They weren't the milky, vacant white of the thing he'd just thrown aside. They were dark, human dark, but rimmed with something faintly luminous, something that pulsed like a heartbeat made visible. His skin held a grayish undertone in the moonlight, veins tracing faint patterns beneath the surface, and yet his face held an expression no mindless creature could have managed. Fear. For her. Get inside, he said, and his voice cracked with the effort of forming words, raw and rusted like something long unused. Now. Mara didn't move. Couldn't. Her whole body had locked in place, caught between the horror behind him and the impossible sight in front of her. He turned back to the three approaching figures, positioning his body between them and the porch, between them and her, and something in that single, deliberate motion cracked through her paralysis more than any scream could have. He wasn't attacking her. He was guarding her. The fight that followed happened too fast for her mind to fully process, a blur of motion in the dark, the sickening thud of impact, a low growl that seemed to come from somewhere between grief and fury. He fought like something caught between two natures, movements too strong and too fast to be fully human, but every strike aimed with a precision, or restraint, that felt deliberate. Protective. Like he was containing violence rather than releasing it. When the last of the three infected finally staggered back into the fog, retreating the way it had come, the stranger stood alone in the yard, chest heaving with breaths he didn't seem to need but took anyway. Slowly, he turned to face her again. Up close, in the spill of moonlight breaking through the clouds, she could see him clearly for the first time. He looked to be near her own age, maybe a few years older, with dark hair falling over a forehead marked by faint gray patches along his hairline. His jaw was strong, his features achingly, painfully human, except for the eyes, and the veins, and the wrongness that seemed to hum just beneath his skin like a held note. Mara's voice came out barely above a whisper. You're one of them. Not exactly. He kept his distance, hands loose at his sides, making no move toward her. Not anymore. Not fully. That's not possible. No, he agreed quietly. It isn't. And yet. She should have run. Every rational part of her screamed to slam the door, to call someone, to do anything but stand on her porch having a conversation with a creature that shouldn't exist. But something about the way he held himself, wary, exhausted, deeply and quietly sad, kept her rooted in place. What's your name? She asked, and even as she said it, she wondered why it mattered. A long pause. When he answered, his voice had softened, like the question had touched something buried deep beneath the strangeness of him. Ronan, he said. My name was Ronan. Was? I'm not sure what I am anymore. Was seemed safer. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of damp pine and turned earth, and somewhere beyond the fence line, something moved through the trees, slow, deliberate, patient. Ronan's head snapped toward the sound, his whole body going rigid with an alertness that looked almost animal, and yet his eyes, when they returned to her, were entirely, achingly human. They'll come back, he said. Tonight. Tomorrow. They found this house because you screamed, and sound carries out here worse than you know. You're not safe alone. And I'm supposed to trust you instead? She couldn't finish the sentence. A monster, he finished for her, and something flickered across his face, quick and wounded, gone before she could fully name it. I know how this looks. I know what I am to you right now. But I've been protecting this fence line for 3 years, Mara Callahan, and I'm not about to stop tonight. The sound of her own name in his mouth sent a jolt through her chest. How do you know who I am? Ronan's gaze dropped, and for a moment he looked almost boyish, almost shy, an expression so strange on a face marked by whatever sickness lived beneath his skin. I used to watch this house, he admitted. Before. When he stopped himself, jaw tightening. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you can't stay here tonight. The fence line broke 2 miles north. That's how they got through. It won't hold much longer, and when it goes, this whole side of town becomes exposed. Mara's mind reeled, trying to hold on to rational thought in a night that had abandoned every rule she'd built her life around. Why would you help me? What do you get out of this? For a long moment, Ronan didn't answer. He looked past her, toward the dark windows of the house, the home she'd grown up in, the home that held every photograph of a family she'd already lost. When his eyes came back to hers, they were heavy with something she couldn't quite name, not hunger, not the vacant pull of the infected creatures behind him, but something achingly close to loneliness. Because I remember what it felt like to be human, he said quietly. And I remember what it felt like to lose everything in a single night. I won't watch it happen to someone else. Not if I can stop it. The confession hung in the cold air between them, fragile and unexpected, and Mara felt something shift inside her chest, not trust, not yet, but the first crack in the wall of fear that had gone up the moment she'd seen him in the fog. A distant howl echoed through the trees, low and guttural, and Ronan's head turned sharply toward the sound. "That's not one of the wandering ones," he said, urgency bleeding into his voice. "That's a caller. It's summoning the others. We need to move, now, before the whole pack converges on this house." "Move where? I don't even know you." "There's a shelter," he said quickly. "Half a mile east, an old ranger station the town forgot existed. It's reinforced. Sealed. Safe, if we get there before the fence line fully collapses." He held out a hand, hesitant, uncertain, like he expected her to recoil from it. "I know I'm asking you to trust something that terrifies you. I know that. But I promise you, Mara, I would rather fall apart in these woods tonight than let anything happen to you." The howl came again, closer this time, joined by a second voice, and then a third, a rising chorus of hunger threading through the fog like a net drawing tight. Mara looked at the hand extended toward her, veined, grayish, undeniably not fully human, and then up at the face above it, achingly familiar in its sorrow, in its fierce and desperate need to protect her from a fate he clearly understood far too intimately. She thought of her mother's voice, gentle and steady, telling her as a child that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was choose to trust the unfamiliar over the fear of the known. She thought of 3 years alone in a house too big for one heartbeat, of a life quietly shrinking around the edges of her grief. And she thought, absurdly, that his eyes were the most human thing she'd seen all year. The fog thickened around them, swallowing the tree line, swallowing the road, swallowing every safe and rational choice she might have made on any other night. Somewhere in that rolling gray, shapes were moving, slow, patient, drawn by hunger and sound and the promise of what remained of her. Mara reached out and placed her hand in his. The moment their palms met, Ronan's breath caught audibly, his fingers closing around hers with a gentleness that contradicted every instinct screaming through her mind about what he was supposed to be. His skin was cool, unnervingly so, but his grip was steady, sure, achingly careful, like he was holding something infinitely fragile and precious. "Hold on to me," he said, voice rough with something that sounded dangerously close to relief, "and don't let go, no matter what you see in these woods tonight." Before she could respond, before she could fully process the enormity of the choice she'd just made, the tree line at the edge of her yard exploded into motion, a dozen shapes breaking from the fog at once, moving with a speed and coordination that no ordinary infected should have possessed, closing the distance to the house in heartbeats. Ronan's grip tightened around her hand. "Run," he said. And the last thing Mara heard, as they bolted from the porch into the swallowing dark of the fog-choked woods, was the sound of something vast and hungry breaking through the tree line behind them, closer than either of them had time to outrun. The world dissolved into motion, branches whipping past, fog tearing around them like torn silk, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath Mara's bare feet. She didn't feel the cold anymore, didn't feel the sharp bite of gravel and root against her skin. All she felt was the iron grip of Ronan's hand around hers, pulling her forward, and the pounding certainty that something enormous was closing the distance behind them. Left, Ronan barked, and she obeyed without question, veering hard around a fallen oak just as something crashed through the space where she'd been standing a heartbeat before. She didn't look back. She'd already glimpsed enough in the strobing moonlight, too many limbs moving at wrong angles, too many shapes converging from too many directions, to know that looking back would only slow her down. Ronan moved beside her with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a body that looked human, his grip never loosening, his other arms sweeping low branches out of her path before they could catch her face. Every few seconds his head snapped towards some sound she couldn't hear, some scent she couldn't smell, adjusting their course a fraction before she even registered the danger. "How much farther?" she gasped, lungs burning, legs screaming with the effort of a full sprint she hadn't attempted since childhood. "Close," he said. "Almost there. Don't stop." The howling behind them multiplied, a chorus of hunger rising through the trees, and Mara felt something inside her chest crack open with pure animal terror. This wasn't a nightmare she'd wake from. This was real, and she was running through it with her hand locked in the grip of something that used to be a man, trusting him with the only life she had left. The ranger station appeared suddenly out of the fog, a squat concrete structure half swallowed by ivy, windows boarded, a rusted door reinforced with steel bracing that looked decades old but solid. Ronan didn't slow as they approached, instead he released her hand only long enough to throw his shoulder against the door, forcing it open with a groan of protesting metal. "Inside," he said. "Now." Mara didn't hesitate. She stumbled through the doorway into musty darkness, and Ronan followed a half-second behind her, throwing his weight against the door to seal it shut just as something slammed into the other side with enough force to rattle the frame. She heard claws, or fingers, or something in between, scraping against the metal, heard the guttural frustration of creatures denied their prey, and then, slowly, the sounds began to recede, fading back into the swallowing fog outside. Silence settled over the small station, broken only by their ragged breathing. Mara sank to the floor, back against a wall lined with old maps and faded emergency notices, her whole body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline. Across the room, Ronan stood with his palm flat against the door, head bowed, chest rising and falling in breaths that seemed more habit than necessity. "You're safe," he said quietly, not quite looking at her. "For now." "For now," she repeated, and a strange, hysterical laugh bubbled up in her throat before she managed to swallow it down. "That's supposed to be reassuring." "It's the truth." He finally turned to face her, and in the dim light filtering through a cracked window, she could see the exhaustion carved into his features, not physical exhaustion, she realized, but something deeper. Something that looked like the weight of years spent alone. "I don't lie to the people I'm trying to protect. Not even to make them feel better." Mara studied him properly for the first time since the chaos of the run, taking in details she'd been too terrified to notice before. He wore clothes that looked decades out of fashion, a flannel jacket, worn boots, the kind of practical wear a local man might have owned before whatever had happened to him. His hands, when he lowered them to his sides, trembled slightly, and she wondered if it was from the fight or something else entirely. "How long have you been like this?" she asked softly. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, staring at some point on the floor between them. 3 years, he finally said. "Since the outbreak. I was one of the first exposed, back before anyone understood what the infection actually did to a person. Most people who catch it lose themselves completely within hours. Something in me." He paused, searching for words. "Something in me held on. Not enough to stay human. Not enough to fully let go, either." "So you're stuck," Mara said. Between, he agreed, and the word carried a weight of loneliness that made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. "I remember everything. My name, my family, the life I had before. I remember what it felt like to laugh, to feel warm, to sleep without fear of what I might become if I let my guard down for even a moment. But my body." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the grayish undertone of his skin, the veins tracing patterns beneath the surface. "My body doesn't fully belong to that life anymore." Mara pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, studying him in the dim light. "Why do you stay here? Near the fence line, I mean. You could go anywhere. Disappear into those woods completely and never have to explain yourself to anyone." "Because someone has to keep watch," Ronan said simply. "The others, the ones who lost themselves completely, they're drawn to sound, to warmth, to any sign of life left in these hills. If I leave, there's nothing standing between them and the town. Between them and people like you. That's not an answer to why you personally have to be the one." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, that she'd pushed past the easy explanation to the harder truth beneath it. He moved slowly, cautiously, and settled onto the floor a respectful distance from her, close enough to talk without shouting, far enough to make clear he wasn't going to crowd her space. Because I remember my sister, he said quietly. She was 12 when the outbreak happened. I got her to safety before I was exposed myself, and I've spent 3 years telling myself that if I keep watching this fence line, if I keep protecting whoever wanders too close to these woods, it means something. It means the life I lost wasn't entirely wasted. He looked at her then, dark eyes catching the faint moonlight. It means I'm still someone worth remembering, even like this. The confession hung between them, raw and unguarded, and Mara felt something in her chest crack open in response, not fear this time, but something achingly close to understanding. She knew that particular grief, the desperate need to matter to someone, to leave behind more than just an empty house and unanswered questions. I lost my parents, she found herself saying, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Both of them, within a year of each other. I've been alone in that house for 3 years, telling myself I'm fine, that I don't need anyone, that the silence doesn't bother me. She swallowed hard. It bothers me every single night. Ronan's expression softened into something achingly tender. You're not as alone as you think, he said. Even before tonight. I've been watching that fence line for 3 years, Mara. I've seen your porch light come on every evening at dusk, seen you sitting on that swing some nights when you couldn't sleep. I never approached because I didn't want to frighten you, didn't want to be the thing that broke whatever peace you'd managed to build. But I want you to know you were never as unwatched as you felt. The admission should have unsettled her, a stranger, a creature caught between life and death, admitting to years of quiet observation from the tree line. Instead, something in her chest loosened, some tightly wound coil of loneliness she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. That's either the most comforting or the most unsettling thing anyone's ever told me, she said, and a small, surprised laugh escaped her, the first genuine laugh she'd managed since the fog rolled in. Ronan's answering smile was hesitant, uncertain, like a muscle he hadn't used in far too long. I've been told I have a complicated relationship with boundaries, he admitted. Comes with spending 3 years as something the world would rather forget existed. They fell into silence again, but it was a different silence than before, less fraught, threaded through with something warm and fragile that neither of them dared name. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the boarded windows, and somewhere distant, a howl rose and fell into nothing. They won't stop searching, Ronan said eventually, his voice quiet but firm. Not until sunrise, at least. The infected lose most of their coordination in daylight, something about the way the sickness interacts with light. We're safe here until dawn, but after that, we'll need to move. Your house isn't safe anymore, not with the fence line broken. Where would I even go? There's a checkpoint on the far side of town, military run, been there since the outbreak. They evacuate anyone who makes it through the woods safely. I can get you there. He hesitated, something conflicted passing behind his eyes. It's the right thing to do. The safe thing. You say that like it's not what you want. Ronan's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked away, toward the boarded window, toward the fog-choked darkness beyond it. What I want doesn't factor into decisions like this, he said quietly. I'm not human enough to build a life at that checkpoint, even if I wanted to. And you deserve a life beyond these woods, beyond the fence line, beyond a man who isn't even sure what he is anymore. Maybe I don't want a life beyond you, Mara said before she could stop herself, and the words hung in the air between them, more honest than she'd intended, more vulnerable than she'd allowed herself to be in years. Ronan turned to look at her fully then, dark eyes searching her face for some sign that she understood the impossibility of what she'd just admitted. You don't know what you're saying, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. You're frightened, exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear. This isn't. Don't, she interrupted softly. Don't tell me what I do and don't know about my own feelings. I've spent 3 years alone in that house, going through the motions of a life that stopped feeling real the day I buried my father. Tonight, in the middle of the worst terror I've ever experienced, you were the first thing that's made me feel truly seen in longer than I can remember. She held his gaze, steady despite the tremor still running through her hands. I know what I'm saying, Ronan. Something broke loose in his expression, relief and terror and hope and grief all tangled together, too many emotions for a face that wasn't supposed to feel anything at all according to everything the world had told her about creatures like him. "I'm dangerous," he said, though it sounded less like a warning and more like a confession of fear. "Not intentionally, but the infection is still inside me, Mara. There are moments, rare, but real, when I feel it pulling, feel the human part of me slipping. I couldn't live with myself if I ever became a danger to you." "But you haven't," she said gently. 3 years of watching that fence line, 3 years of protecting a town that doesn't even know you exist, 3 years of holding on to every fragment of humanity you have left. That's not the profile of someone who's dangerous, Ronan. That's the profile of someone who's spent every day fighting to stay good." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he seemed determined not to fully release. "I haven't touched another person in 3 years," he admitted. "Haven't let myself get close enough to care about someone, because caring makes losing them so much worse. But tonight, watching you run through that fog, terrified and alone, something in me remembered what it felt like to want to protect someone, not out of obligation, not because it gives my existence meaning, but because I couldn't bear the thought of the world losing something as bright as you." The confession settled between them like something sacred, fragile and unguarded in a way that made Mara's chest ache with a tenderness she hadn't expected to feel toward anyone again, let alone someone the world would call a monster. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and placed her hand over his. His skin was cool beneath her palm, the faint pulse of luminescence beneath his veins visible even in the dim light, but his fingers trembled at the contact, curling gently around hers with a reverence that spoke louder than any words could have. "I'm not asking you to be fully human," she said softly. "I'm asking you to let me stay close to whoever you are now. Broken pieces and all." Ronan's breath caught, and for a moment, something shifted in his eyes, the faint luminescence dimming, the grayish undertone of his skin seeming, impossibly, to warm. "You don't know what you're offering," he whispered. "I know exactly what I'm offering," she said, and leaned closer, close enough to feel the strange, cool warmth radiating from him, close enough to see every fracture of hope and fear written across his face. "The question is whether you're brave enough to accept it." Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and somewhere in the fog-choked darkness, the infected continued their patient, hungry search. But inside the small ranger station, wrapped in candlelit shadow and fragile hope, something far more powerful than fear was taking root, a connection neither of them had expected, neither of them had asked for, but both of them desperately needed. "Dawn is still hours away," Ronan murmured, his forehead nearly touching hers, his voice thick with an emotion that sounded dangerously close to love. "We have time before we have to decide anything about checkpoints, about futures, about what any of this means." "Then let's not waste it deciding," Mara whispered back. "Let's just be here. Together." And in the fragile hush between them, the truth already visible in the tenderness of his touch and the fierce protectiveness in his eyes, a bond forged in fire and fog and impossible circumstance quietly deepened into something neither the infection nor the fear of the world outside could fully break. If their story moved you, if you found yourself hoping, against every rule of logic, that a boy caught between two worlds might still find his way home to love, stay close, because Ravenwood Hollow isn't finished with them yet, and the next chapter of Mara and Ronan's fight for a future together is coming soon, right here, waiting for you to press play.